The PlayStation 2 is a special console. Launched by Sony on March 4th of 2000 and later brought to the US in October and Europe in November of the same year, the PlayStation 2 would become the best-selling video game console ever, with sales reaching over 155 million worldwide. Not only did it sell unbelievably well, but it was also supported for an unprecedented amount of time for a home console, with a lifespan stretching from 2000 to 2013, and up until September of last year, you could still send your PS2 back to Sony for repair services. Over the course of its lifespan, approximately 3,800 games would release on the system, and more than 1.5 billion copies of games would be sold. Backing up this enormous library was the backwards compatibility with the original PlayStation games, and the ability to play DVD movies, which made it an incredible entertainment system at the start of the new millennium. During its peak years, many franchises, both long-standing and brand new, would get their time in the spotlight, as the PS2 was home to a long list of classic titles that would come to define a generation of gaming. Games like GTA, Final Fantasy, Metal Gear Solid and Tekken would all continue to make waves throughout the industry on this system, while series such as Devil May Cry, Onimusha, Guitar Hero, Prince of Persia, God of War, Ratchet & Clank, SSX, Burnout, TimeSplitters and more would all kick things off on this console. The PS2 makes me nostalgic just by looking at it, and honestly, every time I hear this noise, it makes me a little sad that its heyday has long gone. This gaming machine has had an immeasurable impact on the industry, along with the lives of many gamers around the world. Until this very day, I am fascinated by it. I am so fascinated that I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the console's early days, but to do that, we have to go all the way back to the start. I've rattled off a bunch of impressive stats and facts already, but what is also impressive about the PlayStation 2 is the number of games it had available at launch. Now, apart from one or two games that were exclusive to Japan, I've managed to get a hold of all of the launch titles for this wonderful system that you could buy on day one in Europe and North America. In total, this works out to 32 games across 6 genres, from action to sport, RPGs to racers, fighters and first-person shooters, along with a few other random titles. So what's the aim of this video? Well, I thought it would be interesting to take us all back to the year 2000, take all of these games for a spin, get a look at the humble beginnings of the best-selling console of all time, and see how all of these titles hold up today. Now, I won't be providing full-on reviews for each game because honestly, who has the time? These are more of my general impressions, because even talking about each of these games briefly would make this my longest video by quite some distance. So without further ado, let's begin. We kick things off with the first game I ever played on the PS2, which is Tekken Tag Tournament. By the year 2000, Tekken was already a well-established franchise, with Tekken 1, 2 and 3 releasing on the PS1, and depending on who you spoke to, there was an argument to call it the most popular fighting game series at that time. Playing it again in 2019, it is pretty much exactly the game you remember it was. I was never great at remembering button combinations for long combos, so I was also never great at playing Tekken. However, that didn't stop me from enjoying it back then, and doesn't stop me from enjoying it now, as the gameplay has depth but isn't overly complex at the same time. Tekken Tag has held up better than most other games in this video, to be honest. The 2-on-2 scraps are still a lot of fun, and although nowadays I prefer my fighting games to be a bit more snappy, I feel like this is just a really solid effort considering it's the series' first entry on new hardware. They take full advantage of the power available to them. I remember seeing these character models for the first time and feeling like I was living in the future, and I also don't feel like this game looks as old as it actually is. This game is a decent showpiece of the PS2 tech, with some well done lighting and reflective materials and surfaces. There are some minor physics at play here with some of the characters' clothing and hair, and overall these smaller touches go a long way. Of course, just like the previous Tekken games, the arenas that you fight in are on this weird rotating platform that makes the movement of the backgrounds a little jarring, but I guess you can't get everything right in time for launch day. The next fighting game on our launch list is Dead or Alive 2, a bit of a personal favourite for myself, and similar to Tekken Tag, it holds up very well. There's something about this series that I've always really enjoyed, and no, before you ask, it's not the jiggle physics. The combat is very fast paced and you can kind of mash your way through a lot of fights, which is probably why it appeals to me, but even when you are mashing buttons, you can pull off some decent combos. DOA 2 offers up snappy combat, throws in a cool counter system for those who want to get a little more technical, and built a fighter that feels like there's a lot of power behind all of the punches and kicks. Another cool addition and why I enjoyed it so much is the destructible environments. I mean, it's hard not to have fun when you can launch somebody out of a window at any moment. The cherry on top of this is that the game genuinely looks great. All of the comments I made about Tekken's visuals also apply here, except I feel like DOA 2 runs better, especially considering how fast the action can get. Are the characters kind of wacky? Yes. Is the plot stupid? Also yes. And is the voiceover so bad that it's good? Absolutely. But it's all part of the charm in a way, and I find it really hard to come up with any serious faults for the game. I honestly could go on for much longer, as this is my personal favourite game from the launch lineup, but also possibly my favourite fighter of all time. But I'll keep it short by saying, boy, this game is fucking great. So I wasn't actually sure whether to put this game in the fighting game section or the sports game section, but I kind of feel like it leans more towards a fighter, as it certainly isn't an accurate representation of the sport of boxing. You all remember Ready to Rumble, right? You know, that boxing game with a Michael Jackson cameo for some reason? Yeah, that game. It is a neat little fighter, not too complex and very arcadey, but it has a lot of style and character to counterbalance its simplicity. It was actually my first time playing a Ready to Rumble game, and I can certainly say that I had a good time. All of the boxers have their own style that shine through with the over-the-top stereotypes and caricatures, and it's another fighter in which you probably could mash your way through and have a decent time. I've got to say, there used to be a lot more of these type of arcade sports titles from companies like Midway and EA back in the day, and it's a subgenre of gaming that I really miss, so this game felt like a cool throwback. I'm not sure which Ready to Rumble is considered the superior one, but this game still has something to offer, especially if you can round up some friends. Finishing off the fighter genre is Street Fighter EX3, which is definitely the weirdest of the bunch for me. This is mainly due to the game's structure that features fights that are 3v1 and 2v2, however unlike Tekken Tag, sometimes all fighters are on screen at the same time like it's a beat 'em up. Also, when you finish a fight, you have the opportunity to add another fighter to your team to take on the next batch of fighters. Don't get me wrong, it still plays like Street Fighter, Hadoukens and all, but a fighting game in which characters can attack you from both sides can be a tad frustrating. I definitely think there is fun to be had here, you might just have to work a little harder to find it. Also, I've always preferred the 2D art style of Street Fighter. Obviously, this is 100% my own personal preference, but I feel like the tech of the time wasn't quite there yet to make these characters come to life in 3D. Something about their design feels a bit lifeless. I know it sounds like I'm hating on this game, and honestly I'm really not. It's perfectly serviceable, but in comparison to the other fighters here, it doesn't feel as well put together. Okay, so now we move on to the genre which features the most titles, and that is the sports games, and we begin with ESPN's International Track and Field. Now, there's not much I can really say about an athletics game. We've all played one of them at some point over the years, so you know the deal. You pick a country, compete in the Olympic Games, and by the third event, you've nearly worn your fingers to the bone just trying to make third place in the 100-metre sprint. To be fair, putting out a game like this during the launch period is a good move, as I've always felt these type of games are great multiplayer titles. The quality might not be that high, but each event is short and sweet, and it's just a good pick up and play party game. International Track and Field is no different from any other athletics game you've played. The gameplay is very straightforward, only requiring 2 or 3 buttons per event, but don't let me mislead you into thinking that I'm saying the game is simple and easy, because I almost came dead last in every event. Visually, there are some highs and lows. The athletes look fine, fine and the animation is surprisingly good in some spots, but on the other hand everything else looks subpar, especially the crowds, but I can hardly hold these sort of things against a game as I don't imagine it had the biggest budget. In short, the game is kind of basic but fun at the same time. I had low expectations, so I don't have any complaints here. Snowboarding games back in this period normally did quite well, and I can imagine when Konami put together Winter X Games Snowboarding, they probably thought they had a potential hit on their hands. However, there was another snowboarding game at the launch party, so when playing this game, it is impossible to judge it on its own merits and not compare it to the wildly popular SSX. Although it may be seen as the lesser of the two, I'll focus on the positives first. So what do I like about this game? Well, I think it controls well for a kickoff. It took me a minute to adjust, but I didn't have any issue with how the game felt to play. In fact, I found it easier to control than SSX, except it didn't have quite the same flair. While the game is perfectly playable, and high score events and the races you take part in are sort of enjoyable, as an extreme sports game there does seem to be a lack of style and personality that you'd find in games of a similar vein like Tony Hawk. Sadly, it's a game that lives in the shadow of another, and because it doesn't have a standout feature of its own, it's a bit of a tough sell. Credit where it's due, the overall presentation is better than I expected, and in a lot of ways it's one of the better looking launch games. Also, as an added bonus, Offspring are featured on the game's soundtrack, so there's that. Okay, now let's move on to the superior snowboarding title. I actually reviewed SSX on this channel earlier in the year, and my opinion on this title has not changed in the slightest over the last few months. This is a fantastic arcade sports title with colourful characters, creative courses, and an awesome over-the-top trick system. And even though the game goes for a very light-hearted aesthetic, it is actually a challenge to play. Not so much that you'll want to throw in the towel, but enough to keep it interesting. Couple all of these cool aspects with boards and outfits to unlock, stats that you can upgrade, creating a nice sense of progression, and you have a game that is just a joy to play. SSX is simple ideas executed well, which means returning to it almost 2 decades later is a breeze. You could easily say that it's the standout title from this launch lineup, and we all know what this series would become. It absolutely holds up today, and I genuinely would recommend picking this up if you haven't played it, because games like this don't really exist anymore. Another sports title from EA here, which there are a few, and to be honest I'm not sure how much I can critique a game like Madden 2001. My knowledge on the sport is so limited that any comments on how this plays as an American football game are barely valid. Honestly, when I was playing this game, I wasn't exactly sure what was going on for a good chunk of time, but I can say this, even with my very basic understanding of the rules, I still managed to have a good time and even managed to score a touchdown. This is an EA sports game before physics played such a major role, so in some ways the gameplay feels simplified and more accessible for someone like myself. It feels like a solid sports title, but as we all know, sports games hold very little value even a year later, let alone 19 years later, so maybe if you're looking to return to a simpler time for your NFL games, you could pick this up, but other than a quick shot of nostalgia, I'm not sure there's much reason to give this a spin. Now we move on to a sport that I'm familiar enough with to comment on, and that is football, or soccer depending on where you're from. FIFA 2001 was one of 2 football games that made the launch of the PS2 in Europe. This FIFA in particular feels very much like a launch game in that all the basic things are there, but there's not much else, and what I mean by that is that if you have a love for how FIFA used to be and you're looking to dive into a career mode from back in the day, then this isn't it. I'd maybe suggest starting around 2005 or later. In terms of gameplay, it's actually a little weird to play because you forget that it wasn't that long ago that players could basically run in only 8 directions and the ball felt like it was glued to a player's feet. This doesn't mean it's a bad game, in fact it makes it easier to play after so many years because there are nowhere near as many variables to consider. You press the pass button, you pass the ball, you press the shoot button, you take a shot, and sometimes it leads to unbelievable goals. Nowadays FIFA is known for its face scanning tech and realistic looking players, but back in 2000 I had a hard time telling some players apart, but I really do like the presentation overall. The other football game on offer at the time was International Superstar Soccer, which is basically the predecessor to Pro Evolution Soccer, and in my opinion is the superior football game in comparison to FIFA 2001. There's something about the gameplay here that feels like it's got a lot more depth, and in general there's just more to think about. When making a pass, you actually have to be facing the right direction for a start, and I feel like the overall build-up of an attack is more exciting than the pass-pass-shoot you'd see from FIFA back in these days. Visually, I'd say that FIFA takes the points. There seems to be a fair bit of copy and paste with some players, but some of the work that the game does to make it appear like an actual sporting event that you'd watch on TV are all welcome touches. For International Superstar Soccer, even under the hood, I'd say there's a lot more going on and a lot more options for tweaking tactics and playstyle, but just like FIFA, if you're looking to play an older sports title, I wouldn't go as far back as this one. But if you're like me and you just have to own all launch games for this system, you can't go far wrong with this game. Just don't expect too much from the AI defenders. Okay, time to get back to sports that I know absolutely zip about, but I'll offer up my uninformed impressions on NHL 2001 anyway. What I can say right off the top is that I think this is one of the best looking games I've played for this video, and certainly the best looking sports game. In comparison to the rest that I've played, it feels like it's further along in terms of being a game that is both a faithful simulation of the sport itself and also offering up a little complexity to its gameplay. Luckily, the back and forth isn't as confusing as American football, which makes the game incredibly enjoyable for me, especially when I get to tackle people. I like that part a lot. Did I manage to score a single goal in my first game? That's not important. What is important is that within the first 5 minutes of playing this game, I was sort of drawn in by it all, from the TV-like presentation to the well-done commentary, the rough and fast-paced action. It's all very easy to enjoy, even if I couldn't name a single hockey team or player. I'm sure NHL games have come a long way since, but the best compliment I can give to this title is that I didn't notice its age one bit. The penultimate game in this genre is also the most frustrating. Surfing H3O is a game that I was really interested in playing just because I wanted to see how you turn this into a full game. Things started off promising and the menus gave me an early 2000s extreme sports vibe that was so popular, and then I actually played the game. So here's how it works. You're supposed to ride the waves, surf up and down and build momentum, and then use that momentum to jump in the air and perform tricks to score points. At the same time, you're supposed to move across the wave to reach a finish line that is usually way off to the left or right, and along the way collect items in the ocean that boost your score. In theory, this all sounds simple, but no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't get the hang of this and just barely reached the score that I needed to progress. Now, I'm fully prepared to accept that I just suck at the game, but this was all in the first few events, and I genuinely lost count of how many times I wiped out. There's a stiffness to the game that means you really have to hold the analog stick to move in your desired direction, and by the time you start moving, you're almost turning too far, and this lack of precision in the controls really did harm the experience overall, so maybe give this a miss. Finally, we finish off the sports genre with Swing Away Golf, a game that I had to purchase 3 times because the first 2 copies I bought were too broken to play, and even when I did get the 3rd disc to work, my PS2 was struggling so much I honestly thought it was going to explode from all of the noise it was making. Swing Away Golf is kind of a weird game. Instead of going for the straight simulation style of gameplay, it plays more like a golf RPG. You start by selecting a character, allocating some experience points, and then you jump into the story as an up-and-coming golfer. It has characters, dialogue, and everything, which is fine, I guess, but out of all the sports to build a story mode around, I'm not sure why you'd go with this one, but at the same time, I kinda have to give it credit for going for something, even if the characters do look a little strange. The actual golf itself is fairly standard stuff, and even though the dodgy disc I own took forever to load, it's an accessible game that anyone can get stuck into really, providing you turn off the soundtrack, which bore into my brain in a really bad way. Hey, remember TimeSplitters? One of the best FPS games of its generation, the series that improved with each sequel and was never seen again after 2005. Well, the first game was part of the launch of the PS2, and it was a fantastic little shooter with great multiplayer that hasn't aged too badly over time. I reviewed this game roughly a year ago and spoke about how fun the game is, so I won't go on for too long in case you've already seen that video. To keep a long story short, despite the old school aiming that'll take you a minute or two to get used to, TimeSplitters is a simple but very enjoyable time. The term run and gun couldn't be more applicable. In fact, your survival is very much dependent on how well you can do just that. While there is almost next to no story or context to the action, the rest of the game picks up the slack by offering you a wide variety of settings to blast through that are set in the past, present and future, along with a good amount of weapons to choose from. You could probably be done with this game in an afternoon, but I doubt you'll regret it. Plus, the multiplayer is the real star of the show, providing you can get some friends over to your house to play it. Moving on to a game in an incredibly similar vein of the first-person shooters with next to no story, we have Unreal Tournament. I came to be a bit of a fan of this series, but that was a bit later in the early days of Xbox Live. What you have here is a game that is clearly built for keyboard and mouse, but the developer has done their best to make it work with the two analog sticks. The shooting does work, sort of. It all feels quite stiff, but I eventually got into the rhythm of things, and the game also does this slight tilt up and down with the view if you're walking upstairs or downstairs that you don't quite have control over. I understand why they included this because console shooters weren't exactly common back then, but it is still weird. The structure of the game is essentially just playing multiplayer matches against bots, and some of the matches can get a bit boring because the AI isn't the greatest. But this is another case where the multiplayer against friends would be the real focus. It's tough to comment on a game that was so clearly made for another type of control setup. All of the pieces are here, the maps are interesting in design, the weapons are really cool, the announcer shouts stuff like "Rampage." It's all there, but the pieces just don't quite fit as well as they should on a console. Finishing off the FPS genre is the arcade classic Silent Scope, a game that I was terrible at playing in the arcade and even worse at playing on the PS2. There's not a lot to say on this one. It is just a straight port of the arcade version and is exactly how you remember it to be. The trouble I run into with this title is that because of the unique setup of the arcade system in which you can actually hold a sniper rifle, there is a big difference in trying to make minor adjustments to your aim when you're using an analog stick with a dead zone. Now, I'm not saying that the game is unplayable, far from it. It is still a fun time, and I could easily see myself giving it more than a few tries in an attempt to get a decent high score, but the controls were certainly the biggest gripe for me personally, as the sensitivity always felt a little bit off. I don't mind that the game looks incredibly dated now, and I don't mind that the story is cliched even for a video game of this period. It's charming in a way, and I was a big fan of these sorts of games, so I guess your enjoyment of Silent Scope will depend on how much nostalgia you have for this subgenre. Here's a game that I didn't expect to enjoy at all, but MotoGP turned out to be interesting enough to me that I've now added it to my backlog. Full disclosure, I'm not good at this game. I've never watched a single race of any motorsport whatsoever, but there was something about the feel of this game that drew me in. Obviously, it leans more towards simulation than an arcade style of gameplay, but the races weren't overly punishing, nor did I feel like any of the times I fell behind were not a result of my own poor judgment of corners and decision making. Racing in MotoGP has an element of challenge to it that you'll want to get better at because the difficulty feels really well balanced, as there is always another racer just in front of you to chase, and if you do make it to the front of the pack, you have to stay on your toes to hold that position. The presentation is also top notch. I love the design of all the menus and HUD elements, and the environments and the models in the game look great also, with no real technical hiccups to be seen. Finally, there is also the icing on the cake for me, which is how good the crashes look, but yeah, solid game, no complaints. So if you've seen my review on Smuggler's Run, then you know the deal already. This game is the definition of a launch title. When I say that, I mean that it has one big feature, which in this case is a big open map that you can freely drive around in with no loading screens, but other than that, the game is as basic as it gets. Now, it is still fun in its own way. You'll race over sand, dirt and snow in buggies, trucks and sports cars, either trying to hit a number of checkpoints reaching the finish line ahead of the competition, or pick up and deliver a package quicker than a rival gang. There really isn't much else to it than that. It does offer some context to the missions through text before each mission, but there are no cutscenes or anything. In fact, it feels like some poor soul back in 2000 was tasked with having to write a new bit of copy for each of these missions. A lot of launch titles can be boiled down to the developers having a cool idea of what they can do with the new tech available to them, and the game is based around that, and this title could not be more of a perfect example for this. Midnight Club is a very interesting game, especially when you play Smuggler's Run and Midnight Club back to back, something I didn't do in the early 2000s, but when doing so today, you start to notice some similarities. Both games take place in a giant open world for you to race around in, both games have the same style of missions such as checkpoints and straight races, and both games have next to no story elements except for a section of text in front of every mission. The final piece to the puzzle is that both were made by Rockstar, and the only difference between the two is that one is a street racer and another is off-road. I can't lie, I was a little taken aback after just 5 minutes with Midnight Club when I realised that Rockstar genuinely made the same game twice and released them both on the same day. A ballsy move, to be honest, but just like Smuggler's Run, Midnight Club doesn't have a lot more going on. Now, obviously, Midnight Club would go on to much bigger things and have a bunch of sequels, and to be fair, I do prefer it over Smuggler's Run, purely based on its look. However, I don't have anything to say about this game because everything I've said about Smuggler's Run applies here also, so I guess I'll just move on. Wild Wild Racing is definitely the worst racing game that features in this video, which is a shame because I thought it had potential. As soon as I hit the acceleration in my first race, the handling of the cars just did not feel right. Sometimes taking a corner the steering felt loose, and at other times it felt too stiff, and overall I felt like I was tolerating the game rather than enjoying it. Sometimes you play a game that isn't a complete disaster, but there's enough minor things that make it seriously hard to find the enthusiasm to keep playing, so I'm not saying there is no fun to be had here, but you might just struggle to find it. I've certainly played worse games, and I'm willing to be a little more forgiving when it comes to launch titles, but even the game's design bugs me. The cars are quirky, so I'll give credit there for not just creating the standard off-road vehicles, but as for the rest of the game, I'm just not a fan. Something about the colour palette they went with, which is a lot of greys and browns, makes all of the landscapes look dull and lifeless. Maybe they were going for a dark and gritty tone, but whatever it was, it doesn't quite work. Believe it or not, up until this point I had never actually played a Ridge Racer game before, and after playing this one, it's clear to me that I stupidly overlooked this series back in the day. For some reason I was under the impression that this series lent more towards simulation, but that's not the case at all, which I quickly learned as I drifted around my first corner. Almost a complete swing in the other direction to Wild Wild Racing, this feels great to play. The cars have a certain weight to them so you're not zigzagging all over the track, but you can still swing around a corner when you need to, giving the cars this sense of power while still being agile at the same time. Sadly, I didn't play this game long enough to get good at it. The AI can be tough to keep up with at times, but this didn't discourage me from playing more of the game. Another bonus is that Ridge Racer 5 looks fantastic. The car models alone are unbelievable for a game released in the year 2000, and when you combine it with the sharp environments of Ridge City and the consistent style shown throughout, you end up with a game that is hard to find fault with. Now we transition over to the action genre, which is basically a mixture of shooters and brawlers, and first up in this section is X Squad, a third-person squad-based shooter. This game could not be a better example of video game narratives and character design of this period. You just have to look at the main character for 2 seconds before you say, yep, this came out in 2000, alright. To give the game credit, I don't think it looks too bad from a technical perspective. It's just very bland and left me thinking it was possibly made in a rush, which wouldn't be surprising considering the circumstances. From a gameplay perspective, I was expecting it to be pretty poor, but I was pleasantly surprised by how well it controlled. It does have some generous auto-aim to help with the shooting, but it doesn't make the firefights too easy. The squad mechanics here are kind of light. The game isn't challenging enough that you'd have to heavily rely on your squad to hold a position or provide cover fire. They're more just there for support and to deliver some truly uninspired voice work. I don't have any major issues with the game, nor do I have anything to rave about at the same time. It's very much a 3-star experience and never seemed to change things up at all. Even the boss battles lacked excitement and just felt like regular enemies but with more health, so I guess the best words to sum up this game would be basic. Fun, but very basic. Do I even need to say anything about Dynasty Warriors 2? The franchise is so well known and we all know what we're in for if we decide to play one of these games, but for the 5 of you that may be unaware, Dynasty Warriors is a melee action brawler with what was at the time some impressive crowd tech. You choose from a selection of characters, all with their own abilities and different stats, then you lead an army into battle, throwing yourself into endless crowds of enemies as you tap on the attack button again and again and again until you've wiped out everyone, and then you do that for the rest of the game. I know that might sound like I'm oversimplifying the experience, but that kind of is it. And although this is the second game in the series, the first game was a fighting game, so this is kind of where this genre began. This was one of the earlier PS2 games that I picked up back in the day and enjoyed immensely at the time. However, it's a little too repetitive for me today, but I can still appreciate what it does well. Taking on 20 people at once is fun, especially when you get to unleash your special attack and the camera does this weird freeze and spin thing. The game is a bit of a technical showpiece as the developer is practically screaming, "Look how many people we can get on screen at the same time." And it is impressive as the characters don't appear to be of low quality. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of launch games can just be one cool new feature and not much else, and Dynasty Warriors 2 kind of falls into that category, but for its time, it was really impressive and holds up well enough if you're into that sort of thing. So I loaded up Gun Griffin Blaze expecting a run-of-the-mill mech-based action game, but what I found was something completely different. First of all, it opens with a kick-ass intro cutscene, then we're loading up our mech and visually things are looking good. We touch down on the beach for the first mission and I found something truly terrible. It turns out that for this game, the developers decided to assign movement to the right analog stick and control of your view to the left analog stick. I know back then these sort of things weren't exactly nailed down yet, but after spending the last 20 years playing shooters with the controls the other way around, you can imagine just how much of a difficult task it was just playing this game. Now, apart from the mind-boggling control scheme, the game is kind of boring. I wouldn't say that there is any aspect of the gameplay that you can latch onto. It is mildly entertaining the first time you take off into the air and fly over to your next location, but it wasn't thrilling by any means. In a way, this game was always going to find it hard to stand out in the launch lineup, as there is another mech game on the PS2 from an already established franchise, so let's move on to that game, shall we? Continuing the trend of kick-ass intros, Armored Core 2 seems to do everything that Gun Griffin Blaze does, but better. It already got off to a great start with me as it's actually easy to control, but I also think it offers more depth at the same time. I don't know much about this series other than it went on to develop a bit of a cult following, and although it's not entirely my thing, I can see the appeal. The customization options alone make it an interesting game, and when you couple that with a non-linear mission structure, you've got a game which every player could have a different experience with. The combat is slightly sluggish, not so much that the gameplay isn't engaging, but just enough to make the mechs feel big and powerful. Another thing that I appreciate is the aesthetic. It feels a bit dystopian, but intentionally so, and I dig it. Like I said, I'm not big on this franchise, or mech games in general, but considering the game is nearly 20 years old and belongs to a genre that I don't really care for, the fact that I enjoyed my time with it is a great indication of how this game has held up. First up for the RPGs is Eternal Ring, a game that I've had on my shelf for what feels like forever now, and I've never had the urge to give it a try until making this video, and now after playing it, well, it's good to know that I wasn't missing out on anything. I think the best way to describe Eternal Ring would be to draw comparisons to the Elder Scrolls games. It's a first-person RPG, a medieval sort of setting, you can use swords and magic to fight your way through enemies, and the only downside is that Eternal Ring is agonisingly slow to play. When I say it's slow, I don't mean that it takes a bit of time for the story to get going, I mean that it's literally slow, like look how long it takes for me to just turn around. When you combine this with enemies that aren't exactly fun to fight, not to mention weird looking, the end result is a game that struggles to find moments of excitement. I suppose that could be considered a little too harsh for a launch title in 2000, but the battles were more of a chore than anything else, and the characters didn't exactly inspire me to push on with the story, especially when some of them look like demons. Moving through the RPGs, we now arrive at a game named Orphan Scion of Sorcery. Now, I think that this game is based on an anime or manga or some sort of pre-existing IP, because when the game opens up it throws you right into the middle of the story with no explanation as to who any of the characters are, but the animated cutscenes are impressive, so I guess it gets credit there. Our main character, who is literally named Orphan, is basically a travelling sorcerer who gets into all sorts of trouble with his friends. You know, the standard TV show formula, and this game plays like an episode of a TV show. Now, I'm almost reluctant to call it an RPG because it has a weird style of action. It's not turn-based, you can technically attack whenever you want, using Orphan's different spells to take on whatever the game throws at you, but the combat is more timing-based than anything else, and I didn't play it quite long enough to fully grasp which attacks were most effective in which situation. The least I can say is that it's unique, not really in a good or bad way. I don't think I've ever played a game like it, but I also have zero interest in playing it again. Evergrace was probably the strangest game I played for this video. I honestly couldn't tell you a thing about this game's story or what was actually going on. The game starts out with your main character awakening in a strange land, and some weird glowing alien bird thing starts talking to you, and before you know it you're off on an adventure to start killing stuff. It's not quite what you'd consider a straightforward RPG of this period, more of an action RPG, as you do have direct control over the movement of your character, and it has this combat mechanic that is connected to your health bar, meaning the more health you have, the stronger your attacks are. The gameplay is perfectly sound, I just found the game confusing. Within a few moments I ran into a lot of weird looking enemies, I met an old man who had lost his dog, I then found his dog but he didn't seem interested, and then I opened a chest and some type of elf creature jumped out and poisoned me. This was all within the first 15 minutes. Evergrace has an interesting look, which is code for it's weird and I don't know how to feel about it, and I wouldn't call it technically impressive enough to pull off whatever style it was going for, but luckily the game is on the shorter side, so you won't have to put up with it for too long if you give it a try. Last but not least in the RPGs is Summoner, which was definitely the easiest of the RPGs to get on board with. This is mainly due to the fact that it plays a hell of a lot like the old Star Wars KOTOR games, in which it's not a turn-based RPG, but you select a special attack or an ability and watch the auto battle play out between you and the enemy. Outdated menus and inventory systems aside, it felt like the standout game of this genre. It is very much a Western RPG in structure, but it didn't require the same sort of learning curve as the other games I played, and I really like its chain attack system that rewards precise timing of attacks with a follow-up attack. One big drawback for this title is the presentation and lack of production behind it. As you can see, the visuals haven't aged too well, and while they aren't bothersome during the action, when the game stops to show you one of its budget-looking cutscenes, which is always just a zoom out of artwork, it almost feels like you're looking at storyboards that somehow made it into the final game. Despite this, you could probably have a fun time with this game, just don't ever expect to be blown away by its technical prowess. Finally, we reach the final section of this video, which is miscellaneous. These are basically a few games that didn't fit into other genres, but also there aren't enough of to hold their own genre. First up is another game I reviewed recently, FantaVision. Most people are aware that this game is a tech demo that became a full game, and it really does show. FantaVision is sort of a puzzle game that features fireworks, and that's it. That's the game. Honestly, you could see all you need to see with this game in less than an hour, and to be fair, I don't mind the gameplay. I think it's fun, but I would be hugely disappointed if I picked this up for full price just because of the lack of content. The game is weird and short. It should have been a free demo included in every PS2, and there really isn't much else to say other than it features some truly bizarre cutscenes with children dressed up in old clothing, so let's move on quickly. Next up in the miscellaneous category is Aqua, which is a dreadfully boring game. The objective is to use building blocks that the game throws at you to build a landscape that can contain a bunch of water that is dropped into the level at the end. Similar to FantaVision, it doesn't feel like it should have been a full game, and I'm not quite sure what the point of all of it is. For some reason this was part of the European launch for the PS2, and I'm not sure why my region got the distinct pleasure of playing it first. Maybe Sony thought we would be into this kind of thing, but they were definitely wrong here. To wrap things up, we have Kessen, a game that for many years I wrongly assumed was a Dynasty Warriors ripoff, but I recently discovered that it's kind of an RTS focused on battles that may or may not have taken place in ancient Japan. I'm still not quite sure. My time with Kessen was odd, to be honest. It's not my thing at all. I've never been a fan of these sort of strategy games, but for some reason while I was playing it, all I kept thinking was that this is a cool game and I'm sure somebody would love it, but it's just not for me. I enjoyed the epic sounding soundtrack, I enjoyed the creativity shown in the designs of the character's armour, I enjoyed the little animations that play out when you order your army to attack. There's a lot of things to enjoy here, but it's just not my thing purely from a gameplay perspective. Kessen did go on to have 2 sequels, and after this I can see why. Considering it is a launch title, it is very well made and doesn't come across as a rushed project at all. Where time is normally unkind to most games, this title hasn't aged too badly at all. And there you have it. Those are my impressions of the 32 PS2 launch games that I could get my hands on. Overall, I don't think you could fault Sony just because they had so much stuff on offer from day one and a good amount of variety too. Obviously there are going to be some highs and some lows. With new hardware and developers trying out new things, you're going to end up with a few games like Aqua, Wild Wild Racing and Eternal Ring. These things are inevitable. A decent chunk of these titles are mediocre when you look back at them now, but at the very least a lot of these games aimed high and went for something. Orphan's combat system is interesting but doesn't quite stick the landing. X-Squad tried to implement squad mechanics but they needed more polish, and Dynasty Warriors 2 threw more enemies on the screen than I had ever seen at that time, but it was very repetitive. Despite a few failures and a couple games that stumbled to deliver in some ways, the launch lineup for the PS2 had some real gems too. SSX is still a great snowboarding game that is worth your time today, TimeSplitters holds up incredibly well because of its fast-paced simplicity, and Tekken Tag is just as fun as you remember, even more so if you're playing with a friend. No console launch is perfect, but Sony's second system got off to a darn good start in my eyes, delivering a bunch of games that were engaging to play and sometimes mind-blowing to look at, and the legacy it would go on to build is still unmatched at this point, and the console still sits proudly on my shelf till this very day.